It's hard to see children suffer. I don't know if there's any sort of way, if you say, no, it doesn't touch me, then maybe you're in the wrong career. So one thing that I think should drive the vision of the department, especially when there's preventable causes of suffering due to social determinants. We must be absolutely relentless in our research efforts to go and figure out those and figure out ways to prevent all these unnecessary presentations. I think it's the one thing that does drive researchers as well. You were telling me about the kid with AIDS. When I got my PhD, one of the students, my fellow students, was a year below me at university. We had a child that passed away of TB meningitis, and he said he can remember I was wiping the tears out of my eyes. I can't remember that well, but that and another story, it's a little bit of serendipitous that I ended up becoming a TBM or making TB meningitis the focus of my research. Last year, I spent time just looking at my family genealogy because I decided this is nonsense. I cannot only know my grandparents' names. I'm going to make a concerted effort so that my kids know where they're from. And my mom has a photo of when she was 8 years old and her little sister was 5, and told me her name was Joan and she passed away early. She was in a wheelchair. And I actually traced her death certificate. And on the death certificate, cause of death was TB meningitis. So it's a bit of a note that brings it. I mean, it's absolutely serendipitous. I ended up obviously with lots of mentors along the way, but choosing that disease that still affects so many children in our setting, still having that on their death certificate. I'm choosing that as a career. So I think that's going to still drive me. I mean, there's so much things to do because we can't be in the same place 70 something years later and kids still have a preventable disease on their death certificate. I mean, that cannot happen.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and this is the Awakening Doctor podcast, a space where we discover the personal stories of those who work in the medical and health professions. Join me as I explore the hopes, the fears, the aspirations, and the real-life challenges of those who carry the title, responsibility, and privilege of being a doctor. Joining us today is Professor Regan Solomon, a distinguished paediatric neurologist and the executive head of Paediatrics and Child Health at Tygerberg Hospital and Stellenbosch University. Regan is a globally recognized clinician and researcher and an inspiring teacher and mentor to many. A man with a big, generous heart who remains rooted in family, community, and his humble beginnings in the Cape Flats of Southern Africa. A visionary leader who is deeply committed to social justice and who has dedicated his life to advancing and improving equitable healthcare for the children of South Africa. So welcome, Regan. It's lovely to have you with us here today.
Thank you. Nice being here and nice seeing you again.
Yes. And welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Amy is the producer and editor of the Awakening Doctor podcast, so it's great to have you with us. So, Regan, let's begin with who is Professor Regan Solomon?
So that's a loaded question.
I know.
Let's start with Regan Solomon because I think there's a bit of a difference. So Regan Solomon is from Cape Town, born and bred in Cape Town. I grew up in Mitchells Plain, went to school in Athlone and Claremont, and then moved to Kuils River where I completed my secondary school training. I mentioned those places first because that's where my roots are. And I also mentioned some additional roots. My mom comes from Genadendal. So I always mention that I spent lots of my holiday time in Genadendal because my mom is a teacher and was always studying and was doing courses during the school holidays. So that also forms a little bit of my background because I think there's a long history in Genadendal that was imprinted on me from quite early on. Regan Solomon's also the family man. I am married to Galen, my beautiful wife. I have 2 beautiful kids, 12 and 9, Nicholas and Celine. And that is completely my outside of work persona. I try not to bring the work persona home. It's a bit of a protective mechanism because the work persona is Prof. Regan Solomon. I think I've grown into the role of Prof. Regan Solomon. So I'm a full professor in child neurology at Stellenbosch University. I'm an associate professor in 2016 and a full professor in 2021. And as from the beginning of last year, I've been the executive head of pediatrics and child health at Tygerberg Hospital and the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University. So that's the work persona. And I think with that comes big responsibility. So my usual Regan Solomons, which is fairly laid back and I like quiet time. The Professor Regan Solomon's role doesn't quite allow for that. You have to bring something else to the party because you don't just speak for yourself, you speak for the children that is seen. I speak for my colleagues, and I also speak for up and coming students and school students that are also hopefully going to follow the same journey that I did.
So you and I met at the beginning of last year when you were, a month into your new leadership role?
Yes.
And we walked a little bit of a coaching journey together. And I'm aware that stepping into this leadership position has been quite an interesting and challenging opportunity for you. What would you say a year down the line about what it is to be the executive head of pediatrics at Tygerberg Hospital?
It's a privilege. I think it's always been a privilege. I knew that. I think the responsibility is probably much bigger than I thought when I stepped into the role because you do cross disciplines. So you're involved in lots of discussions outside of pediatrics and also strategic discussions where you're part of things that can impact 10 years, 15, 20 years down the line. So that is, I think, part of the evolution of being the head. It's just a responsibility that I've kind of grown into or thrown into in the beginning of last year. But I think there's also lots of opportunities to really add your voice and make a difference. It's a difficult role to adjust to because in your head, you followed the academic and scholarly process, and the thinking was it's just a next step. But I think the impact that you do make and the circle of things that you can impact on and the people that you impact on is a lot wider than I think one thinks of when you enter the job. You think it's just all academics. I'm going to see patients. I'm going to do this, that, and that. But that clear 5-year vision and mission, definitely there's some points that added onto that by the second year of the job, definitely.
Right. Is there anything that has surprised you about what it means to be in this job?
I'm quite a laid-back guy, and as a colleague, always cracking a joke and would have a coffee. But I think the colleagues have also accepted the role, so you really get called on for your advice and planning. And I suppose it's probably the experience that I could offer, but I've never thought of it in that way before, that there is a bit of respect, at least, for the position. And even outside of pediatrics, people actually want to know what my thoughts are on things. What is my view from anything from healthcare to research to teaching? It's enlightening and also something that I've had to grow into.
Right. So we've dived into where you find yourself today, and part of the intention of this conversation is for us to tell your story. And so I'm wondering if we can go back a little bit and you tell me, where should we begin in terms of telling your story?
Could probably start when I joined UCT as a 17-year-old first year MBCHB student. I think we can start there. A lot thinner and a head full of black hair.
Okay. I wonder, actually, as you talked about that, I'm remembering a story you shared, I think, on LinkedIn about your grandmother who bought you a book about medicine when you were still at school.
You're right. I really should start at that point. I think it was quite poignant. This book on the bookshelf, it doesn't have a spine anymore, but it's, if you look at the content of the book now, it's probably not worth reading for the type of medical knowledge that's in there. But when I was in standard 9, so that's grade 11 in 1991, my grandmother told me that she saw this book and she actually took it on lay-by. So she paid it off over a few months. And I got the book when one of her friends gave it to me at her funeral. And we'd always spoken about, I want to become a doctor one day, actually to both my grandmothers. And she took it upon herself that this is going to add to my education because it's a medical book, and I think she wanted to do a bit.
Wow.
So, I mean, it does stay with me. It's not going anywhere. I think it's probably part of the reason why I went to do medicine in the first place. And I think if you go dig a little bit deeper, I didn't know my grandfathers. They passed away long before I was born, but both my grandmothers were widowed quite young. And my parents grew up really under dire circumstances. And both my grandmothers were what you call live-in domestic workers, because my grandmother from Genadendal was a living domestic worker in Sea Point. I can't recall where my other grandmother was, but that's where it started. And they did that so that their sons and daughters could finish school, and the eldest looks after the youngest. And on my mom's side, there's few success stories from my mom's generation, how they helped each other just to get through. But I think it starts there for me, the profound impact that my grandmothers had on me.
I remember reading the post that you shared with the picture of that book that doesn't have a spine, and being really touched by the tribute that you made to both your grandmothers for the impact they had had on your life. And it felt to me like you had such a deep respect and acknowledgement of the contribution, but also the legacy, and almost a sense of responsibility to continue that legacy.
At that time, you don't quite realize you're trying to do well at school, but here we have two elderly ladies realizing the potential and putting lots of effort and encouragement into to at least getting me at least to enter the race, because I think when you're 14 and 15, you don't quite think that deeply. But I think once you reflect now, I mean, there's so many people to say thank you for their journey. So I have to do what I do well. I have to add on to that. It starts with my grandparents, but not to forget my parents as well. From your fourth year in medicine at UCT, you go to different hospitals. And my father let me use his car so that I could go to Princess Alice and Somerset Hospital, Victoria Hospital, and he rode a bicycle to work, not for any leisure reasons. So he was quite strict. He didn't have tertiary education, but he knew exactly what his sons were capable of, and didn't accept anything below what he thought your best was. But usually he was quite right with what he knew your best was. And my mom, who's still alive, who's still a major supporter, I just have these really good recollections from my varsity years as well. And my other grandmother, she passed away in 2002, and I was already long done with medicine by then. And always nice to get their faces like, you went to study medicine. And I always thought, why is this? I mean, it's not such a big thing. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. But I think it's the journey that the previous generations went through when those options weren't available to them. I think it's what makes it now poignant for me to reflect on.
Absolutely. So why medicine? What made you decide that medical school was the right place for you?
Before my parents moved house, I went to look at my old school books, and somewhere in there is a standard 2 composition in very ugly handwriting saying that I want to be a doctor one day because I want to help people, wear a white coat and wear a stethoscope around my neck. So those were my 3 reasons. But as far as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a doctor. I don't know. I think I've ended up in the right place, sometimes following opportunities and not by choice, but I think I've ended up in the right place. I think the need to help people was a big driver for me.
Where did that driver come from? What made you realize that people needed help?
I can recall back to school, just going to visit a GP for a cold or an ear infection. I was in awe of this person wearing a white coat with the ability to make you feel better. And I think there's just something in there that resonated really early on without thinking of where I am now and the type of improvements I want to bring. I think it really starts there, just feeling that you get when somebody says, thank you, I'm better, or comes back to you and a kid brings you a drawing, or this mom, the end of last year, got my address from one of my friends, and I had seen her son when he was 11 years old, still in primary school. I treated him in the ICU and I followed him up every 6 months until fairly recently. And she went to buy me a watch to say thank you because it was his matric farewell and just to say thank you. And in my head, I just really was doing my job. I want to see this guy better and always asked how she is, how her husband, how the family's doing without consciously thinking that I'm made an impact on people. I'm just really glad and touched that somebody would come back to me after all these years and just say thank you for what you do.
That's lovely. What was your time at UCT like?
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't enjoy it. It was before the time of gap years. I was a bit young. I had turned 17 the November before, and off I went to UCT. I made some fantastic friends along the way, but I can remember registration day. I think growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was the first time I'd spoken to somebody white and somebody black in my life. And I stood there with actually no words, nodding. The black guy that stood in front of me actually was my clinical partner throughout, made the toast at my wedding. But it was such an eye opener then. You grew up in this sheltered community because I think the spatial placement of people in apartheid, you grew up with people who looked like you. And I didn't know at school that there's much of a life outside. I'm glad I went to UCT because I've made some lifelong friends. On the other hand, at UCT, there was still, I think, the type of support for students that didn't traditionally come from what we call now Model C schools. You were just left on your own. So it's one of those things that people don't need to say, but you can feel when people really are not interested in your education. And we kind of stuck together as black doctors trying to help each other to answer questions. And if I can recall, I don't think it was anything conscious from anybody in the class. I think it's just growing up at that time. They just say the horizons and the minds weren't broad enough at that time.
So a very polite way to say that people's privilege blinded them to some of the circumstances you were dealing with.
Yeah, people with privilege hang out with other people with privilege. So very few privileged friends from my undergraduate year and a hell of a lot after I finished my MBCHB degree. And I think it's probably how I developed as a person as well and became a lot more vocal in saying exactly what I would like. And as you know, I always try to act and say things diplomatically, but I think I always get my message across. But on reflection, it was just when I think of the three places that I've studied, UCT is the one that had some memories for me of great friends made, but no other special memories, to put it bluntly.
You're right. What were the other two places that you studied?
I studied at Stellenbosch. I did my pediatrics training and my MD and my fellowship training. And then I did my PhD was joint between Stellenbosch and Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Right.
It was a different experience then, but I think by then I'd also matured and grown as a person. So I have only positive memories.
Why pediatrics?
Actually, as an undergraduate, I didn't like pediatrics at all. I think I rotated through times of the year when I spent every week having a different strain of gastro.
Yeah,
so
I remember
it wasn't the most pleasant experience. And I rotated through pediatrics as an intern, and it was okay, but didn't hold any special significance. And I think in my community service, which I did at Worcester Hospital, we had an amazing pediatrician, Dr. Ralph Diedrichs. And I think just the way he interacted with people and his colleagues and the patients and his approach to life in general, I know of a good few people that became pediatricians because of him. And I think he's a big reason that I became a pediatrician when I went to work in the UK the year afterwards. And when I came back, I still harbored ambitions of wanting to be anything but a pediatrician, a surgeon, an ENT, a radiologist. And I went back to Worcester and the only posts that there were in pediatrics. And I said, okay, and ended up doing my diploma and quite liking working with the kids. And I became a registrar the next year. Sometimes your discipline or specialty chooses you, whether you like it or not. But reflecting back, completely the right choice for my personality. And I think probably just my journey then just led me towards pediatrics.
Amazing. We've spoken about this in one of the previous episodes, but it's so often the case that people resist a particular discipline and then a mentor of some sort, a role model of some sort, or circumstance, as you say, the other posts are not available, and then you take this post and it opens up a completely different direction than one you had imagined.
Yes, and I think the role modeling is so important and to implement because people look up to what you do. They want to do things like you if you perceive to do it well, and how you treat patients and how you treat families. So, I mean, it did make an impact on me, and I had some really great role models subsequently. And you do end up going to these colleagues for their advice, and they do shape the career route that you take. And there's definitely an opportunity to implement or forcefully implement role modeling. And I have had some conversations with some colleagues, almost like a mentorship pipeline where you can match mentees and mentors wanting to follow a certain journey within academics, because it's not something that's openly available once you are a postgraduate student. As an undergraduate, I think there's resources that are put into place, but really the mentorship to shape career, there's definitely a place for that and definitely an opportunity to plow back.
So you've touched on two things that I know are very close to your heart. The one is mentoring and coaching others, and I feel like you're quite passionate about that. And I read something you'd written recently about the importance of the knowledge transfer, not just about the academics, but also the experiences, particularly for students from underserved or underprivileged communities, how to avoid the pitfalls, how to succeed in a clinical or teaching or research career, how to define the next career steps or identify opportunities. I was going to say, where does that come from for you? But I think I can make some assumptions about that. I'm curious about what it was like for you. Who provided that mentoring and that guidance for you?
So when I started as a registrar in pediatrics, Dr. Ralph Diedrichs, and somehow at Tygerberg, I ended up, I think my first rotation was in pediatric neurology, and I hated the rotation. I didn't like it at all. I started at 7 and left at 7, and was like a father figure consultant, Prof. Schoeman, and his colleague Ronald van Toren. And they asked me at the end of that rotation, would I consider pediatric neurology as a career afterwards? And my answer was no. Definitely not. And I spent another 2 rotations there. And I think the way that they emphasized life balance definitely made a big impact on me coming through the ranks and played a big role. And my academic journey as a researcher and scientist, it's definitely with lots of input from the 2 of them. Ronald van Toren is still around as one of the pediatric neurologists. We're good friends, and I chat to Professor Regan Solomon fairly regularly. At that time, there was a little bit of a metamorphosis. After I worked in the UK, you come back with a much broader worldview and a lot more confident and assertive of yourself, maybe without any academic background to this. But I did find it profound that years to white Afrikaans speaking colleagues really providing a father figure and an academic figure that was quite profound for me. And I think with the Afrikaans community at Stellenbosch, what you see is what you get. I do like that.
I remember you telling me about your time in the UK and how surprised you were by some of the stereotyping and assumptions people were making about you as a doctor from South Africa. Tell us a bit about that.
That's definitely humorous. So first, when you are not a South African and an African doctor, you get treated a little bit differently. So people watch you to see what you do, double check your scripts. But after a few months, things settle and you then become part of the confidant circle when a new doctor starts and they're like, oh, we have to watch this doctor. They're from this country. So it was quite hilarious. And I think the first assumption that people made, they try to place me in a country because South Africa doesn't stick, because if you're in the UK and if you're from South Africa, you have to look and speak a certain way. And I try to explain to people South Africa is a massive country. Cape Town is different to Durban, different to Johannesburg, different to Pretoria. And I got asked to translate for a patient, went in and thought to myself, why would somebody that's Afrikaans not speak English? And when I got to the patient, it was a Mexican patient speaking Spanish. I had to go back and say, I don't speak a word of Spanish. Oh, I thought you were from Mexico. Cape Town is a few thousand kilometers from Mexico. So it was quite hilarious. But I think the United Kingdom, at least London, is such a hodgepodge, and people from everywhere. I think the English are quite reserved and they're very suspicious of outside. But I think I'm lucky to say it seems as if it's metamorphosized into a very open society.
So you say that it's very humorous and you laugh as you tell the story. Was it always funny when you were working in that situation and people were making those assumptions?
No, an example was when I got asked to prescribe or give medications that was prescribed, and this was changed. And the doctor was a surgeon. So in the UK, they called Mr. I stood right across him and he spoke to me via the nurse. And I answered directly to him, not knowing any different. And I had to speak to the nurse who relayed the information to him. So I found that incredulous. I was a little bit angry at the time. But yeah, then you just think of the pounds that they paid you for your service, which did dull the anger a little bit. Thinking back now, it's not right. And hopefully things have changed a bit there.
Well, I know that kind of addressing some of those concerns has been a theme of your leadership vision for this last year. How's that going?
We had our first transformation workshop this year. I think it went very well. I think with discussions last year, I set out very nicely what my vision of transformation is, which is a little bit broader. It doesn't just the reflex thinking is always you speaking about people's ethnicity. And it's a transformation in thinking how you become a 21st century pediatrician and how you interact with 21st century patients and their families and colleagues that come from South Africa and Africa and outside, and how you do research and how we interact with each other as colleagues and how we embrace new technologies in teaching. So it's broad, but in essence is how do you interact with people to get the best out of each other and the best for your patients. So first transformation workshop went well. I think we were given opportunities just to speak a little bit about ourselves. It was short and it's going to be a regular theme. Every 6 months, we're getting actually my previous HOD, Prof. Mariana Kruger and Prof. Sharon Kling are going to give a talk on the ethics of professionalism. So I want to get my vision of transformation across. How do you transform a 20th century pediatrician to a 21st century pediatrician in basically what is a global village? How do you hold your own in these times?
Right.
And I mean, you have to do that because if you go back to the patient, it's best for the patient, and that's the bottom line.
What would you say are some of the biggest differences between the requirements of a 20th century doctor and the requirements of a 21st century doctor in South Africa?
Your worldview has to be much broader as a 21st century pediatrician. I think you encounter people that you might not have worked with before, patients you've had with migration. We have lots of different patients in our setting, and the world is a global village. We're doing research with lots of different collaborators from all over the world. And since COVID, there's this spirit of technology that can help us how to think a little bit differently and how to do things that we've done for the last few decades, how to do it a little bit better and think of ways to improve services for children. So I think that's the big difference. 20th century pediatrician in South Africa, I think because of circumstances at that time, I mean, you had your very closed worldview and this is what you did. And the world is different now, and we have to, at least on a research level, we have to compete.
Yeah. What would you describe as some of the major milestones or turning points in your career, or in your life rather than just career?
Turning points, that's a difficult question. I haven't thought of that one. I think in my third year as a registrar, before then, I was a little bit, let's just say, after hours, life kept me busy quite a lot. Maybe a little bit frivolous and I think superficial, not thinking deeply about the impact that you can make. And in my third year, after a night out, I broke my leg and had to lie in bed with a back slab for 2 weeks thinking about the world, which is a good way to let you think. And it does make you think of where you are and what you do and what is the impact that you would like to make. After that, there was a bit of a mindset change. And then I think the other turning point when I met my wife in 2007. So before they can read between the lines, I like the after hours life. And yeah, I met somebody I was completely ready to settle down and just bring a different aspect to my career. And then when I fathered kids, I mean, that is obviously a quick fire way to just think differently about the world and what sort of legacy do you want to leave behind for your children. So that's beside the day-to-day stuff, nurturing and making sure that the children don't think of boundaries without having no boundaries, if you get what I mean, how to encourage them to be the best version of themselves. At a last turning point when I got Desmond Tutu Freya University scholarship to embark on my PhD studies. I think it was one of these decisions. Prof. Johan Skuman told me there's this opportunity. He thinks I must embark on this. It was about 2 years after I'd finished fellowship training. And it wasn't actually a question. It was more of
an instruction.
A bit of a push. I said yes without thinking. And it was ups and downs for the first 2 years. And then things just clicked for me and it opened so many research doors and just thinking about being a doctor in an academic setting, because it's always patient first, but you have to be a researcher. You have to ask questions. You have to add to the body of research from your setting, and you have to be able to know how to teach well, and you have to be a leader and an advocate for patients, because you can't just do the one. It's not a 9 to 5 job. Clock in, clock out, see a few patients, write up panados. I mean, the impact is so much broader than that. And I think having those different aspects also makes things a little bit fun as a doctor, because you can become very despondent with things like austerity measures and those sort of things. But you think back, the job that you in has so many facets that if one makes you despondent while you're thinking about strategies for that, there's some other exciting things to keep you busy. And I like the multifaceted nature of being a doctor in the academic setting. It's actually quite a privilege.
I noticed that when you were describing all those different things that one is required to do, you said the phrase, I have to, I have to, I have to. Was there ever a feeling of choice in this vision?
I don't think there is a choice. I think it's a privilege, I think, for a doctor of my background to have come through and become a prof and being an executive head. I don't think there's many in Cape Town, but I think being cognizant of where I come from and my journey, I think it's one of these things that I have to do. I have to plow back and I have to make sure that there's a lot of better Regans that come through the ranks, because we're going to need good people out there, because I think when it comes to the country's finances, we're going to need innovative thinkers with climate things. We're going to need our visionaries out there, and you need role models that look like you. So it's a bit of a duty. And I think in the last year and a few months, I've had a good few job offers. Surprising, because a while goes by and you're in your career, but my answer to them is always, I have a vision. I have to see it through for the time period that I've set. So it's just something that I think needs to be done.
Does that ever feel like a burden?
I think sometimes it is, because it does obviously influence your decision making, and you think of other opportunities that you could have had. Would your kids like to go to school in another country? Would I like my salary to be double? There's obviously things like that, but not that I'm not paid well. But the bottom line is, it's a privilege to be in this position, and there's a whole provinces of children and their health that needs to be looked after. And I think there's plans underway for that that's going to bear fruit down the line. So I think those thoughts outweigh all of the others.
What did it take for someone with your background to reach the position that you're in today and have this role and responsibility? When you say it's a privilege for someone with my background to be the executive head of pediatrics, what did it take, Regan?
There's obviously lots of people with my background, but that have things like black tax where you have to look after your grandparents, your parents, your siblings, and it's a reality. This needs to be done. I think it's probably one of the reasons why we don't retain enough academic staff that look like me, and it does need a serious consideration. But I think it's taken a long journey to get to that point, even though some people say, Regan, you're quite young. I'm 48 now, but I mean, my journey at the Stellenbosch University started 20 years ago when I entered the registrar program, and it's been highs and there's been lows. It's registrar time, fellow time, the time spent completing a PhD, trying to elevate your voice so that you're the voice that can speak on your experience. It takes lots of time, and at least I can say there's a few people that look like me that are starting to come through the ranks. Not that all people have to look like me. It's just, it's so much nicer, and there's so much advantages to having a diverse leadership because you have different worldviews. It just means there's so many options to tackling problems if you have different points of view.
What do you think it would have meant to you to look ahead and see a Professor Regan Solomon who was starting out on this journey?
I had no such thoughts. When I was a registrar, my only thoughts were, I'm going to finish. My best friend from school at that stage was a vet in Hong Kong, and I was going to go to Southeast Asia with him, and we were going to backpack for 3 months. That was my only plan in life. And then the fellowship position came up, and I thought, no, it's a good opportunity. I have to take this. At that stage, I really enjoyed pediatric neurology, and just after that, I met my wife. So I think there's a reason for for everything. And I think the journey basically sorted itself out from there. At that stage, still no thoughts of becoming a prof, but I must say kudos to my previous head, Mariana Kruger, who really kept you on your toes and sometimes explained your journey for you. But she had a very clear vision with clarity, told me what I needed to do and when to get to the next steps. And you totally need a person like that. So I think I knew exactly what I needed to put in, the type of collaborations, the type of research and output that I had to do, because you have to tick those boxes. There's no transformation, profs. People become prof because you fulfill the criteria, and it's the same journey for everybody. And it's nice to know exactly what you need to do to get to that step.
Right. I remember you telling me that you were surprised when you got the position.
There were a few candidates, I think, that I thought more senior than me. So you go in with a little bit of trepidation, and I thought I'm going to just present myself, and I had to tell myself I have what it takes to do this job. I'm ready. I do tick all the boxes, and it takes a long time to get there, because sometimes if you're a little bit self-effacing, you know, am I good enough? And you have a little bit of imposter syndrome, but you have to get over that fairly quickly. So I was very shocked when I got called on my birthday, incidentally, in the evening to say, you're the new executive head for pediatrics starting the next year. And I think it's still lots of emotions from that day.
And a year into the role, I asked you this at the beginning, but how are you feeling about the role now?
The role's challenging. I think I'm surrounded by a fantastic team. They're passionate people. They will sometimes differ with you, but always for the children first. And I'll have that team supporting me any day of the week. There's some senior colleagues with lots of experience. Everybody is really brilliant at what they do, and some young up and coming colleagues that I can see really is going to make a difference. So I think I have absolutely no concerns there. I think the broader concerns is the austerity measures that I think is facing the Department of Health as well as universities. It does place lots of strain on services and colleagues. And I hope to get to a space where the visionaries can come to the fore, like in COVID, so that we can address. I mean, it's always children and their health first, instead of having a conversation about this is the rands and cents that we have available. So let the visionaries do their job and come up with new ways of doing things. It's challenging, I must say. I think the amount of financial challenges is quite huge and is quite stressful, but on the flip side, I'm surrounded by a fantastic team. And in the faculty, my fellow executive heads are also fantastic human beings, and we do make lots of collective decisions.
What is your vision for children's health in this country? What are you hoping we'll head towards?
I still haven't veered from my vision that I pitched when I interviewed for my job, which is world-class care for the children in our province. I think there's always a temptation with austerity measures to say, we can only do what is available. But we have the expertise and the will and this fantastic colleague. So why should we not keep world-class care as the focal point for the children in our province? I still haven't veered from that.
I find myself wondering what it's like as a pediatrician to be a parent, because even as a doctor or as a GP, there were often times where I felt completely out of my depth as a parent. And I remember once, and I haven't admitted this publicly before, but my daughter fell off the bed. It was one of those moments, where they roll and they fall unexpectedly. Until then, they haven't rolled yet and you don't expect them to move. And I phoned the hospital. I was a young GP then, was doing locums in other people's practices. My baby was still quite small. And I phoned anonymously a helpline and asked what were the signs that I needed to look out for. Even though I kind of knew, I just wanted to double check. And I didn't want to admit to a friend or a colleague that knew me that I had let my baby fall off the bed. So I'm wondering, not only a doctor, but a pediatrician and a pediatric neurologist watching your children grow and develop.
If there's anything medical, so my brother-in-law is a pediatric pulmonologist in private. If there's questions, my wife goes to him. She tells me I don't give her good answers because I think sometimes being a pediatrician in an academic setting, you really see the sickest of the sick children. So sometimes your answers for a little bit of a scratch and things are a little bit blunt. So I don't do that. I'll play the supportive role. Ice and a little bit of a hug and kiss, and anything serious, my brother-in-law has to give advice. And I think that's probably, I think my wife will agree, that's the best policy regarding our kids.
Did you find yourself monitoring their neurological milestones and looking for developmental delays?
I'd like to say no, but I'd be lying through my teeth. So I know when they're supposed to sit and crawl and walk and say words. And a funny story is my son was, I think, a few weeks short of being 18 months and he wasn't walking yet. He was crawling and shuffling and rolling around. And my mother-in-law told me, you have to take this child to a doctor that sees these things. I had to tell her that would actually be me. But 2 days before 18 months, he just got up, went to fetch his ball that was somewhere else, walked back, and then just crawled for another 2 days. And then after that, it was fine. But in the back of your mind, but you try not to do any informal assessments. I don't think my wife would have liked that.
Yes, I can imagine. Sure. What would you say are some of the high points of your life?
I think the high points is getting married and fathering kids and being in the same room when they were born. I think those are definite high points. And then my graduation, especially my doctoral defense in Amsterdam, where I was privileged enough to have my family, my parents and my in-laws and my brother in Amsterdam. If you defend, it's a very old process and you have 10 minutes to give a layman's talk. And then you get asked questions by a panel of people and you go up onto the stage with what you call two paranymph. So my brother was my paranymph and one of the colleagues from Amsterdam, and we were in full penguin suits with tails and a white undercoat and a white bow tie, all of us. And this goes back to medieval times when the academics presented their research, because if it didn't agree with the Catholic Church's findings, it might end up in a fist fight. So that's where the paranymph comes from. So I did this.
Wow.
And at the end of the questioning, it's exactly an hour. And at the end of an hour, I think the beadle in formal attire will stamp the scepter on the ground and say, ora est. That means time is up. The examiners go deliberate and you left outside the room and then they congratulate you afterwards. I'll never forget it. The pomp and the ceremony was quite nice and it was lovely having family there with me. And then also two younger brothers, seeing them also succeed in their careers and becoming dads, and also seeing their whole career progression. Yeah, I think we're always there for each other, and I'm very proud of them and my brother and sister-in-law as well from my wife's side.
Lovely. What about low points?
Low points. I think my final pediatric exam, and I tell this to the students, they don't believe me. So I failed my final exams. Looking back, I don't think I knew what I was doing. I think I was too cocky and went the exams maybe 6 months early. It was a low point, and I think it obviously changes your focus after. It does take a while because at that time the exams is everything. And now it's just a story that I used to encourage the registrars, because I think the academic maturity comes at different times for different people. And I think just the weight of expectation also for me, you have this thing that you think is the ultimate thing. And yeah, sometimes it becomes so overwhelming that you totally mess up. So that was definitely a low point. And then I think I'm still lucky to have my mom, but when my dad passed away, because yeah, I think we were sort of quite close as a family, and the whole family was there when he passed away. So that is an obvious low point. It wasn't a good time.
I read somewhere that you were also the main sponsor for the Tygerberg Pantry Project. Tell us what that is and how you got involved.
2014, a few stories came out where dear students would faint on the ward rounds because they haven't eaten, and these were final year medical students. And we had a student at stage, Omeka Okeke, and we started talking about it. So I have sponsored a lot, but I've also involved Karen Baikis, who's the Vice Dean of Teaching and Learning, and also had really good links with the students, and the students really look up to her and told her, Karen, how can we get this going? So it started with some personal donations from me and my wife, and every month we used to go to Macro, buy foodstuff and toiletries and things for about 2 years, until we had two amazing students that really took the pantry project by its horns and took it into the student consciousness. So with lots of events, and people knew what the pantry project was about. So lots of donations, cash and foodstuff donations. And the problem hasn't gone away, not at all. I think with the bursary scheme that students have, sometimes it only pays out later in the year. So the first few months are tough for the students. And when I heard of this for the first time in 2014, I'm like, how can this happen? This cannot happen. And I think it's grown from there. We have amazing students involved now. Prof is still involved with myself, and it's in the awareness of people know who the Pantry Project is. And each year it's just also amazing to see the students' growth and initiative that they take to help grow this. So yeah, it's 10 years old now, and took a bit of a dip during the time of COVID when students weren't on site. But it's now getting to a point where we're going to need support, and we're going to need to strategize how to support students that are on the decentralized platform. But there's definitely people involved and people willing to help. So it just came from a need and a feeling to say, no, it cannot happen. Not in your 6th year, not on my watch.
How do you think it went unnoticed for so long? Because I imagine 2014 wasn't the first time that we had students hungry on campus.
I think it's having a student faint on the ward round, because I don't think it's something that you would tell people about in your group. And I think the student passing out on the ward round, I think that just crystallized that. And then you actually start speaking to people, and you get a sense of how extensive the problem is. So the lines are open. People know it's there, and it's still an issue. We need to support our students. They're going to be the future doctors. They're going to be the future visionaries. And we want to make sure that all of the things are in place so that these students have the best opportunity to get through their MBCHB and go make a difference to country and their families.
I'm just thinking that there might be people listening who don't know about the project, and I'm happy to share the link for donations and things at the bottom of the podcast info, so I will do that. But maybe let's just explain to people what the Pantry Project actually does. So you donated food and toiletries and things like that, and now there's an established pantry where students can go.
There's outside students, they have societies, and then all the different residences have pantries. So students can go to the pantries and anonymously get some starches and things that they would need to eat. And regularly we also try and find out what the big needs are at the moment, because it does differ depending on the time of the year. And I think for March and April, we just did vouchers from the student center just to make sure that students can get these vouchers anonymously, because it's not something, I don't think you want to make people's identity known, but if we just go the same process where all the other students go to eat, it's an option. I'd love for it to grow to a point where just there and we don't have to worry about donations and things. It's a never ending project. It's not a business. It's not a profitable. You have to dispense what we have, because the reason the pantry project there is to ensure there's no food and hygiene product insecurity for our undergraduate students.
Gosh, Regan, I think it's an amazing project. And I think, I really just want to honor and appreciate you for getting involved and for not just being aware of the problem, but actually doing something really practical for you and your wife to go shopping and buy food and buy toiletries and donate them to the students. It's quite something.
I had to get my wife involved. She's much more organized than I am. It was quite nice. And you go around and obviously you have to go to place and get the best price and get some things. And I think it's just your social impact you do. And you don't see it as a duty, not even a paying back. It's something that needs to be done.
Well, I think that's testimony to who you are and your character.
I think I was just at the right time with the right student, but I don't think it's something that you can just ignore and say no to, because it's one of these things that just gnaw at you, and this cannot be right. So I think it's become a doctor-led initiative to a student initiative. And just the types of students over the years, it's really fantastic to see them actually running drives, and Karambaiki is being the wise heads to give advice, but sort of really getting the student body involved. I think that's also a leadership, mentorship role, but it's nice to see the growth.
In the same place where I read about your involvement in the pantry project, I read that you have a life quote that you live by, and I'm not sure you will know in this moment which quote that is, but it had something to do with dragons.
I can't actually remember the quote.
That's what I thought.
You can read it to me. It's from a Rwandan author, but I just found it was absolutely profound. But you can read it back to me, please.
So the quote goes, "Did you know you could destroy dragons? Dragons are not actually real. They just roar to scare you from your goals. In fact, they are afraid of determined heroes. They take flight at their approach."
Somebody eloquently put down, I think, what you face, and there's a little bit of the imposter syndrome built into there, and it's the dragons are just noise, or just your own voice telling you, no, you can't do this, and if you do ignore it, you're singular in your purpose and you know what needs to be done, then you have to go out and do it.
What helps you to be a determined hero?
Having a supportive structure outside of work, and having a soundboard at home, being able to tell Galen what's bothering me. And I think it's nice to have a non-medic, because we can speak to each other about each other's careers, and it's often about the people, but it's nice to have a soundboard, and just having really humorous moments with my kids, because your journey is your journey at work and you have to have a purpose, but that work-life balance is so important. If you don't have a balance, I don't think you can be a balanced leader. If you miss the big picture, every little jigsaw puzzle has to be in place. And if one's missing, the big picture is not complete.
So what are some of the dragons you've stared down?
Sometimes there's internal dragon and there's external dragon. So the internal dragons is, am I doing this the right way? Am I really meant to be there? Why am I doing this? And you have to constantly stare them down as I am in the right place and at the right time. And then the external dragons is just establishing yourself as a specialist and academic and getting your voice heard. So I think in meetings, I tend to be reserved and I'm not going to shout, but I'm still going to say, no, this is what I actually want to say, and just have to say there's no who you're going to be scared of. It's only yourself. And I think if there's something important to say, and it's a lot easier to do it if you're doing this on behalf of the kids and you're doing this on behalf of your colleagues, especially, and obviously for yourself, but there's just certain things that you need to say. And I think those dragons are in the early part of the journey when sometimes you think, maybe I should have said this, or the opportunity didn't present itself. I mean, that's absolutely nonsense. If there's something to say, you get to the person and it needs to be out there because there's a purpose in mind.
Anything we haven't talked about that you want to share?
Growing up as a kid, I'll never forget my dad. We were in Worcester and we went to my dad, sort of parked and said, myself and my brother go and get ice creams.
Mm-hmm.
And we were not so politely asked at the age of 7 and 4 to go to the back entrance where you could still get our ice cream, but this wasn't the entrance to be used. I do remember it. And another opportunity when I think I was in high school already, where we were at I think one of these holiday resorts and went to a table and sat down. And this elderly man of a certain prehistoric South African town came to sit there and told us to leave because he wants to sit there with his family. And I remember my dad just being very blunt and adding a little bit of colorful words. What would happen if he doesn't leave there? So just things like that does make a difference. Why I do remember it, because on the flip side, the bulk of encounters and people, absolutely fantastic people that you've met along the way that really make those encounters nonsensical. And you're like thinking that cannot happen. I think we've moved on as a country. We're not in that space anymore. I'm not quite sure if everybody's moved on in their minds, but I think it's just one of these things that I will always remember. And I'm so glad that my kids are never going to have to go through that sort of thing. It must have been so much worse for my parents and the previous generations.
Gosh, sorry that happened to you, Regan. Those are horrible experiences.
When you're 7 years old, you don't quite know what to make of it. You don't know how to react. Somewhere deep down, you know that's wrong, but you just wanted your ice cream, and so patently wrong. And I'm so glad that we've moved on. Obviously, there's as a country, there's so many challenges, but we're really in a different space when it comes to interacting with people and worldview than we were. But obviously, lots of work still to be done. It's not like it's all a rosy picture, but I think it's a work in progress so that those sort of things don't happen. And those are just stories I remember. I mean, there's a lot worse for other people going up where it's very blatant, or some that are still very blatant, and that's wrong.
And I know that those experiences are not limited to your childhood. I think you've had some even in this last year of leadership, some of those much more subtle, much less easy to label prejudice.
I think you do encounter when you get suggested to make certain decisions, you do realize what's going on here. I mean, this is not right, and it's really subtle things, and it's not something that's overt. But at that stage, you wonder: is it because I'm a black head of department? Is it because I'm a young head of department? What's going on here? I must say, looking back now, a year later, I think I'm in a different space. I think also a little bit more assertive. And I think it's also to realize those for what it is and its potential to undermine. And I think just to be really fixed with your vision and not to sway with your vision while still being approachable and a listener and taking the team forward.
I imagine that it's also quite hard to have ticked all the academic boxes, fellowships and PhDs and research and publications, and then to still have people measure you based on those other criteria, race and ethnicity and age.
Something that shouldn't happen, obviously. Yeah, you tick these boxes. And I must say, it's one of the things that I often think of. And in some respects, there's obviously still legacy of apartheid. People think in a certain way, and people think about themselves in a certain way as to what your boundaries and what your ceilings are. And it shouldn't be. I think it's the work and the journey and the type of person you are, and also having ticked the boxes. Those are the things that should count. And you should be measured by things that you said you were going to do and the things that maybe you promised and you didn't do. That's the measurement of leadership. Shouldn't be anything else.
A couple of times in telling your story, you've told me about moments where you thought you were going to do this, whether it was taking 3 months to go backpacking in Southeast Asia, or you weren't going to do pediatrics, or you weren't going to do, and yet the thing that was offered to you was not something you thought you wanted, and you ended up doing it, and it turned out to be the right thing. What would you say is driving that?
I call it the career magnet. No, it's sometimes fate has already, your journey is set out. How you get there, sometimes takes a different road and a bit of a different time. I think looking back in my career as a pediatric neurologist, I was completely in the right place. I like problem solving. I absolutely loved it, even though I didn't choose it right at the beginning. I was in the right place. And sometimes experiences and mentors and patients you see do impact your journey, but I feel you always end up in the place that you're supposed to be. And I would have been a horrible surgeon or radiologist.
What makes you say that? Why would you have been a horrible surgeon?
No, I think I really like working with the kids and I like the process. I think if you end up in a place that maybe you thought was the career for you and ends up not being so, I don't think you'll quite be in your happy space. You have to be happy in your career. It mustn't be your hobby. It certainly must be something that you tell other people what you do with absolute joy. I think that's the point that you should get to.
So when I finished my internship, I did a 6-month rotation through pediatrics as a medical officer. And it was a little bit of a baptism by fire because they threw me into what was then Ward J2, which was all the babies who were born under 2,000 grams. And I remember having to stick needles in their little feet and draw blood. And it was really traumatic. At the slightest shift in temperature or whatever, they would get really sick and need surgeries. And then later, when I was working in the ward, it was at the time when we had quite a lot of HIV positive babies in the wards. I remember 2 patients in particular. One was a little girl whose parents came from a rural area, and she'd been in the hospital for 6 or 9 months, and she had AIDS. And no one was visiting her because the family didn't have the means to come to the hospital. And everyone was scared to touch her. You know, you had to put gloves on. It was in the days before we fully understood HIV transmission and how to protect ourselves. And I remember holding this child and being the only person who would go in there and hug her. But it was more about me taking care of my own inability to deal with what she was going through. Like I was creating all sorts of stories about her suffering, and some of them probably true, but just it was so hard for me to witness that suffering. And then later there was a child who was about 11 who was a diabetic, and similar story, parents from rural area. She'd been in the wards, newly diagnosed diabetic, and took some time to regulate her diabetes. And I ended up bringing her home with me for a weekend so that she could get out of the ward. How do you work with children who are suffering on a daily basis and or be responsible for taking care of large numbers of children as the head of a department? How do you stay positive and hopeful and optimistic?
I don't think there is a choice not to. It's hard. It's the beginning of my career. I struggled because, you would lose children and go through all sorts of self-inflicted inquest to what should have been done differently, and you bring those sort of things home with you. And I think, especially with neurology, it's really nice to share good news, but often you have to share bad news. And I think the way I dealt with it is just trying to put myself in those parents' shoes, and they want all the information you cannot withhold. And sometimes you have to be a little bit, not blunt, not rude, but just give all the information, and you need to repeat it a few times. But it's hard. It's not pleasant. These children, especially once I became a dad, it does hit you. That's why I think that onus is on us. We must try and do the best as we can for the children. It's hard to see children suffer. I don't know if there's any sort of way, if you say, no, it doesn't touch me, then maybe you're in the wrong career. So one thing that I think should drive the vision of the department, especially when there's preventable causes of suffering due to social determinants. We must be absolutely relentless in our research efforts to go and figure out those and figure out ways to prevent all these unnecessary presentations. I think it's the one thing that does drive researchers as well. You were telling me about the kid with AIDS. When I got my PhD, one of the students, my fellow students, was a year below me at university. We had a child that passed away of TB meningitis, and he said he can remember I was wiping the tears out of my eyes. I can't remember that well, but that and another story, it's a little bit of serendipitous that I ended up becoming a TBM or making TB meningitis the focus of my research. Last year, I spent time just looking at my family genealogy because I decided this is nonsense. I cannot only know my grandparents' names. I'm going to make a concerted effort so that my kids know where they're from. And my mom has a photo of when she was 8 years old and her little sister was 5. and told me her name was Joan and she passed away early. She was in a wheelchair. And I actually traced her death certificate. And on the death certificate, her cause of death was TB meningitis. So, yeah, it's a bit of a note that brings it. I mean, it's absolutely serendipitous. I ended up obviously with lots of mentors along the way, but choosing that disease that still affects so many children in our setting, still having that on their death certificate. I'm choosing that as a career. So I think that's going to still drive me. I mean, there's so much things to do because we can't be in the same place 70 something years later and kids still have a preventable disease on their death certificate. I mean, that cannot happen.
What a story. I often talk about how the lineage and the legacy of that lineage expresses itself through us, and that there's no coincidence that you choose TB meningitis as your field of study coming from that background. Maybe we should just honor Joan. What was her name, her full name?
Joan Elizabeth Africa. My mom was child number 6. Joan was number 7 out of 11 children, and she's the only one that passed away during childhood. Still, obviously, my mom can definitely remember, and it's a disease that's completely eradicated in resource-rich countries, and it's a disease of poverty. Call it what it is, and we cannot still have that happening. So, yeah, thanks for the memory of Joan.
What are the stats in South Africa, do you know, at the moment?
It's getting worse. I'll give you the local stats. So at Tygerberg Hospital, we still admit 40 to 60 children a year with TB meningitis. Just before COVID, it went up to 100, and we have of the highest prevalence of TB in the world in the area surrounding Tygerberg, the Ravensmead area. But I mean, our children with TB meningitis do come from across the province. So it's a disease that's completely eradicated in the global north. Call it what it is. It's a disease where people have no food and where the shelter is poor. That is what causes it, and I think it's a focus point, and it's right that it's being researched, all the multiple facets of it, because it's a horrible disease we shouldn't be seeing. But unfortunately, I mean, that's how I ended up with TB meningitis as a research career. Basically because of my 2 mentors, Johan Skuman and Ronald van Toren, who had established a big footprint in TB meningitis research. But we had the patients that nobody saw in those numbers elsewhere in the world in children. It also starts with what they call the social vaccine, which is food, together with obviously lots of other things.
I feel this overwhelming welling of emotion in my heart when I listen to you, and I can feel almost the pain of the suffering of that situation and the things you are witnessing, and the incredible heart with which you hold it all, and your deep commitment to being part of the solution, and a lifetime, certainly a career invested in making a difference in these communities that are underserved and under-resourced. And I almost feel this compulsion to say thank you. Thank you, Regan. Thank you for the work that you do in the world.
I'm part of a team, and there's so many people like me out there trying to do their bit to make a difference. I think my specific role is coordinating that next generation of doctors that see patients and ask questions. Why is this horrible things happening? And you go do research and you tell people what you find, and you go and find a cure or prevention for these diseases. If there's one thing that I do besides for putting the children and their health first, is facilitating that next generation of visionaries and leaders to come through. This fantastic people drawn to pediatrics and child health, everybody wanting to make a difference. And sometimes we need a little bit of a mentor voice and an enabling voice, but we need an army of such people with the problems we're facing. But no, you start one by one.
So on that note, what advice would you have for a young person who's thinking about studying medicine?
My advice would be, if you're going to embark on a career or planning to study, you must really want to do it. It's not a fashion statement. Think you're going to become a gazillionaire practicing medicine, get those thoughts out of your head. You're here because you're bright and you want to make a difference to patients. And I would also tell them there's such fantastic career options. You can see patients, but you can become a teacher. You can study teaching of medical students. You can do research, there's admin, there's management, there's so many different facets of medicine. So there's really a place for every sort of personality, but you must have a passion for medicine if you want to embark on a career.
Anything you regret looking back?
No regrets. No regrets. I think obviously there's decisions along the way. There's good ones, and sometimes you make bad decisions, but I think it's part of the journey where you're meant to get to. As long as you don't make bad decisions purposefully, I think on reflection, your decisions do evolve. Sometimes a little bit more information, but no regrets. I think once you make a plan, you do have to go for it.
So what are you hoping is next for you? Not just as a professor of pediatrics, but as a man. What does the future hold?
First, my wife will say there's always room for improvement as a husband. So I would start there. I mean, my children are still in prep school, also to see their journey and provide them all the support so that they can end up in their desired choice of study and career. And I think as a man, staying in the same community as I grew up in, having the opportunity to plow back as well and see if we can get some fruit from some hard ground. And next step in my career journey, we'll see where it takes me. I think I've experienced different facets of the Department of Health and the university and the broader pediatric structures in the country and research globally. So we'll see where the journey goes, but always one that sometimes with regrets always said yes for opportunities, but it's always learning opportunities, and we'll see where the journey goes. No specific plans. My journey is that at least the 5-year vision and mission in pediatrics, and should really be longer than that.
Right. I imagine that career magnet may play a part in directing this next stage.
Yeah, it does. Sometimes opportunities do open up maybe some aspects that you've thought you never were going to. Exactly. You didn't even think about it. But I think if I can give advice to myself from outside is throw yourself in and be open to new opportunities and see what comes from it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anything you'd like to ask, Amy?
Did you ever make it to Southeast Asia?
I went for a TB meningitis congress to Vietnam. It was absolutely fantastic. And so in my second year of reg studies, I went to visit my friend who at that stage was in Hong Kong, and we went to Thailand as well. 2 young guys in Southeast Asia. I can't tell any stories, but I would love to go again. It's just a culture that's so totally different to ours with amazing food. I think I'm a little bit too old for backpacking now, but the travel bug is still there and wanting to see new things. But I think at this stage is to share it with my family. For 3 months with a backpack, maybe not, maybe a little bit shorter, and with a trolley case would be a little bit better.
Yes. Wiser traveling. It's so interesting with these conversations because I never know who the guest is going to be, and I like to come in completely blind, and then I start listening to your story, and then there are all these random things that pop up, and I'm like, wait, and it's so strange. There's always these parallel lines. The connection between Worcester, my family's from Worcester, dragons are very important to me. Then at one point, I swear to you, I'm not making this up, I kept thinking about ice cream, and then you started telling your ice cream story, and I was like, what is going on? And it's like the more you talk, the more I kind of, it just starts, something happens. It's quite phenomenal. And I just want to say thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you for all the families that you have helped heal, the children's lives that you have changed, the families, just telling that story about that child whose family you checked up in every 6 months and the mother brought you the watch. You're clearly having an incredible impact on people's lives. And there are going to be so many people that are going to enjoy hearing a little bit about who you are and the essence of who you are. And I just want to say it really was phenomenal hearing your story today. And I'm very, very grateful that I was allowed to be part of this. So thank you.
No, I'm glad Maria knows from the coaching sessions. I think see where the conversation goes and flows, and I like the unstructured nature of the talk. And Maria's good. She always gets you to tell you think you're on safe ground and we're just covering, and then Oof, you have to say stuff that you know is deep, but has to be done. So kudos, Maria.
Thank you for trusting me,
Yeah, no.
Regan.
All I can say is, at least for my brother-in-law and from Karenbike, is they've had fantastic experiences with you, and I'm glad they followed my recommendation. And I told them it's going to be hard because she's going to make you ask those questions that you know are crap, and you're going to have to answer to them yourself. So don't go there expecting. It's for a purpose to get to a certain place. So thank you.
I never take it for granted that people trust me with their stories. It's always a privilege. And sometimes I think people hear me use the word privilege a lot, and they probably think I just say it. But I really, for me, the work that I do is a huge privilege. Having people like yourself in senior positions dealing with really important issues trust me to hold a space for you to think about what's going on and how to be more efficient or more effective, or how to be more centered in what matters. I can't really describe what it means. And it was such a privilege to work with you, Regan, and to share your story today. I think that I've said to you before, one of the reasons, and I say this almost every time, but one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was that in those private, confidential coaching spaces, I was getting to know my colleagues in ways that I felt the public never got to know people. And when one hears the words Professor Regan Solomon's executive head of pediatrics at Stellenbosch University, it conjures up these images that often have very little to do with the reality of the man who's sitting there in that role. And I feel like your humility today, your huge, warm, generous heart, your commitment to matters of social justice, that's exactly what I want people to understand. Again, we have this idea of academia, we have this idea of research and big pharma and public perceptions of what that's all about. And actually behind it are people like yourself with this enormous heart and this enormous commitment to making a difference in the world.
It's that Prof. Regan Solomon, even sometimes I don't know what that is, because just it's your role at work, and whatever journey I think brings you towards that, which includes where you come from. And I'm glad that I can bring a little bit of this, hopefully something new to the role and make a difference.
What are you taking away from today's conversation?
I'm actually thinking back to that first contact session that we had, and I can see the growth from then to now. It's been 16 months into the role, and there's definitely some growth, and I think a lot more of a willingness. I think my vision is still as clear in my head, but I think still hopefully answering things succinctly, things that should be answered, and or having thought about these already and having a plan. I think that's what I'll take away. I think that first contact, are you a little bit apprehensive in the job? And I can see there is like a teeny weeny little bit of growth from then to now. So I'll take that out of it.
Fantastic. And I'm struck by how so often when people look at how you got to this place in your career, they're looking at the checkpoints academically. You did this, and then you did this, and then you did this. And it's almost the thing that qualifies you to be the head of pediatrics is this academic journey. And actually, as I listen to you, I'm thinking the thing that qualifies you to be the head of pediatrics at Tygerberg is your heart, is your integrity, is your vision, is your leadership skills, this generosity of spirit, and this commitment, to use your words, to plowing back.
It's the one thing you speak, you have to have all these boxes, ticks, and your CV has to be perfect to apply for this job. But what really helps you once you're in the job is actually none of it. It does get you to a certain point. But it's how you deal with people, and are you resilient, and are you agile? Can you listen to people, and can you speak and be firm at the right time? But it's always a singular purpose. You must know why you're in the job, and it's never for yourself. There's always a bigger purpose.
Well, and you said earlier that it's a privilege for someone from your background to be in this position. And I almost want to say that that's the legacy of internalized oppression, because I think that actually your legacy, that grandmother who worked as a domestic worker and bought a book on lay-by because she knew you wanted to go to medical school, that father who rode a bicycle to work every day so that you could have access to the car to drive to the settings where you needed to do your training, that aunt who died of TB meningitis, the upbringing in those underserved communities in South Africa, your experiences as a colored man, those are the things that make you the best person for this job now, Regan.
Those lived experiences and that worldview puts you in a very unique place to
Exactly.
understand people's challenges and also the academic challenge, all those things, because you tick those boxes. I come hopefully with broad view of things, and sometimes all those determinants outside of what you see. I do tend to think about those things a lot. I must just end off with I went to 3 weeks ago. I spoke at my old high school. So a few of the matriculants, I think, that finished for 7 years after me, they organized a career day and almost a motivation session to the matriculants. And I could only come for an hour because it was a Monday morning, and Monday morning in my job, there's lots of things to do, but they asked me to give a 20-minute talk. The principal of the school is a lovely lady, Mrs. Basson, and she said the overwhelming factors at the school is food insecurity. So when they do have study sessions, all the matriculants are coming, but they have to organize soup, bread, and those things. So I had prepped in my mind a talk that I was going to give, and then I thought I'll speak about something else, and then I just ad-libbed. All I saw in front of me were matriculants really ready to go make a difference for their families and sticking the course, and they were there, they were present despite all those other things, and was just a wow moment for me just to try and motivate and show the matriculants from my old school that yes, it can be done. And there were the whole panel were people that have made a success in different careers. Yes, it can be done. And we're from the school and we're from this community. But I didn't see single parent households or grandmother led. All I saw was guys sitting there with a singular purpose. They're going to ace this year's matric exams, and then they're going to enter, and they're ready for their plan to make a difference. And that was quite encouraging.
I'm sure it was wonderful for them and inspiring for them to see and hear from you too.
Yeah, myself and the other panelists, I think at that old school, you tell them there was a professor, and I'm not the only professor that came from the school. I know another professor, I think, in anthropology, but professors can come from the school, and sportsmen, and I think there's a radio DJ, and there's no reason why you can't go into your chosen career with all those barriers that you face. I think things aren't going to go hunky-dory. I mean, that's a given, but you have to stay the course. It was nice, and I actually want to see, how we can formalize this climb back to the school, maybe strategize a little bit how we can make this a little bit broader than just speaking at the career day. So quite keen to do that. I've thought about it a little bit.
I have no doubt you will make a contribution, and probably quite a significant one. Thank you. Thank you so much, Regan, for your time, for your presence, for who you are as a man in the world. Really, it's a privilege to know you. I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and you've been listening to the Awakening Doctor podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends, follow Awakening Doctor on Instagram, Facebook, and Spotify, and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and give us a good review. Thank you so much for listening.